Chapter 14. Morning came on Turtle's feet as Izzy shoved her arms into her borrowed housecoat. Though she'd been kissed before, it was as if Conrad's had torn all others from her memory and burned them to bits. Lula had told her that Barton admitted he'd loved her from the moment he'd set eyes on her, and now Izzy knew that could be true. It was as if the Lord had whispered to her, "Conrad was the one I wanted for you, dear child," and it was foolish to refuse. As she tugged her stays in place and tied them, she caught her reflection in the glass. A year and a half ago, she had had a rounded bosom and more thickness about her middle, which had curved down to more shapely hips. Now she was narrow from head to toe. Strange that she had found herself pretty then, but not as much now after becoming the woman her husband had wanted her to be. Even after she had changed as he had wished, he had never really wanted her again anyway. Only the few times he had been too broke or couldn't sell anything to visit the saloon had he touched her. Until her husband had told her she shouldn't be pleased with her appearance, she had been. In the time she had been at the ranch, she had gained back a little of what she had lost, and she rested her hands on the slight indent at her waist. It was time to let go of everything he had done and said. He was never going to be sorry. He had died without so much as looking at her. She had chosen to marry him, and now he was gone. Izzy smiled as she slid her blue dress over her head. She wasn't big, not anymore. Maybe she never had been. Conrad had claimed Harland was a liar, and those were words she could believe in. Her Bible lay on her bedside table, and she flipped it open to the letter her mother had sent her when she had first become a wife, the one telling her to be happy with her husband, and she tossed it into the burn basket. She was free to write her mother, free to say what she liked, free to accept Conrad's court, if he asked her. Free. No one would miss her if she took a few minutes to write the letter she should have written before she had left Tinton. And it was past time to face her mother. Words flowed onto the paper as she detailed Harland's passing and what he had done to her. The letter was soon 2 full pages, and Izzy scanned the text to be sure she hadn't missed anything, nor misrepresented anything. Her mother would be sorely hurt by the missive, but if her family loved her, they would accept her. She held the cedar pencil aloft for just a moment, then signed Isabel Harmon. Her family name was better than the one she had married into, and the name Conrad had chosen to call her sounded better to her ears. She didn't want to be Izzy Lawson anymore. Moretta flung her door wide, and Isabel gasped, clutching at her hair still in a plait down her shoulder. "Izzy, Lula needs you. It's time." Time? She hadn't prepared. It was still almost a month early. Even now, her heart ached at the thought of watching Lula give birth, when she should have just been filling out with her own bundle. But that couldn't be changed. Harland had taken one thing from her too precious to ever forget. But Harland was gone, and the only one who could put salve on that wound was the Lord. "I'm coming." She left the letter on her desk and flung her hair over her shoulder as she rushed from the room. Barton and Lula's home was about a quarter-mile away, south of his parents'. Moretta led the way as Isabel had never been there. Barton's horse waited, saddled right outside the front door. "He came and got me. The doctor's not in town today." The words chilled her through the July heat. They wouldn't be able to fall back on the doctor. She'd have to do it alone. The fear nipped at her resolve, but there was no one else. Her only friend needed her. "And have you attended a birthing before?" Isabel huffed as she pushed harder to reach the house. "Only my own." Moretta sagged slightly as they reached the door. Barton opened it and pulled his mother inside. Isabel followed quickly. He raked his hand through his hair. She's hurting. You've got to do something." Moretta patted her son's shoulder. "That's the way of it, Barton. A woman isn't like a cow or a horse. Remember your scripture, son." Isabel couldn't possibly forget. "And women will have pain in childbirth." Lula moaned loudly from behind a door somewhere down a short hall. Barton led her to their room, and she swallowed hard, setting her shoulders and fortifying her spine before she stepped inside. Lula's knees were up, though she was under a sheet, and her head swung slowly from side to side as she moaned. Terrible noises, the likes of which Isabel had never heard before, shook her to her very core. "Lula, I'm here," Isabel said as she approached the bed. Lula glanced up, her face crimson and puckered as she curled forward. "I don't know what to do, and I wasn't ready for this. I've got another month. Isn't there a way to make it stop?" Isabel gripped her fingers. "If there is, I surely don't know it. I think we've just got to get the work done." Lula groaned again and threw her head back into the pillow, arching her back. "I can't do this. I just can't. I want my sisters here, my mother." Lula gasped and balled up again, clamping her mouth shut. "I'm going to go get towels and the like. I'll send Barton in with you until I get back." Lula shook her head. "No, don't. The poor man is terrified, and it makes it worse. Just hurry back." Instead of sending Barton, she met Moretta at the door. The older woman had already collected towels and water. A set of sewing scissors was tucked in the tie of her apron. That was something Isabel hadn't thought of, and a job she wouldn't offer to do. Moretta handed Isabel an apron and eased past her. "I'll get Lula comfortable on some towels and sheets. You get that man out of the house. He's about fit to burst with nothing to do but worry, and he won't listen to his ma." Isabel closed the bedroom door and found Barton sitting at the kitchen table, his head cradled in his hands. She sat with him and took a deep breath. Everything would be better if she could leave, be anywhere but there. But Lula needed her. Someday, she prayed fervently, Lula could return the favor and be there for her birthing. "Barton, you can't stay here. Listening to her will drive you mad. Go out and work for a while. We'll be here. There's nothing you can do for her." He tipped his head to glance at her. "She said that her sister Jenny only ever labored with her husband. Doesn't she want me there with her?" The truth was always best, but hurting a man when he was already down was just plain mean. Her sister's husband knew just how to help her, because they had planned for it. He wasn't worried for his wife. Can you say the same?" Barton's head plunged back into his hands. "No, I can't. I never want to see Lula hurting, and this was my fault." Poor man. She laid what she hoped was a reassuring hand on his arm. "Barton, she is your wife. This isn't your fault. It's a blessing." As Conrad came in, Isabel jumped to her feet away from Barton. She smiled at him for a moment, but leaned forward for her words to only reach Barton's ears. "Besides, I'm sure Lula had no part in it whatsoever." Barton's head shot up, his eyes wide at her jest. "Now, go with your brother and get something done. We've got work to do here." Whether it was the shock of what she had said or his brother's presence, she didn't know. Something motivated him to stand and stomp outside, leaving Isabel alone with Conrad. He strode toward her and took in every inch of her face as he brushed her braid over her shoulder. "You look terrified." Her heart hadn't slowed since Moretta had busted into her room earlier. "I am." Conrad took a step closer to her and held her for a moment, which was far too short. "You're just here to help your friend. The work is up to Lula. Pray for her and the little mite, and I'll check on you later." He bent and brushed his lips over the top of her head, then followed Barton out of the house. Lula screamed, and Moretta called for Isabel, and her insides clenched once again. The situation had been much easier to consider while Conrad had held her. Isabel rushed back into the room as Lula arched her back and yelled. A few minutes later, Moretta cut the cord on a baby boy. While Moretta cleaned up the bawling baby, she tasked Isabel to wait for the afterbirth. But after a few more pains, it was obvious Lula wasn't finished. 15 minutes later, Moretta cut the cord on her granddaughter. This time she handed the baby to Isabel to wash up, while she stayed with Lula. The baby was ruddy, its movements jerky and cry-strong. She had a fuzz of blonde hair all over the top of her perfect tiny head. Isabel was immediately in love with the child. Isabel's desire to have her own grew with each moment of holding the precious newborn, until she thought the ache would never subside. After Lula was washed down and the bedding changed, she cuddled both children close to her. "Now, I want Barton to be here. I would guess he went out on the range and won't be back until supper. Do you suppose he'll expect me to cook?" Her eyes were wide, and she held her bundled children a little tighter. Moretta laughed. "Men don't quite understand the work that just one of those tiny babies can bring. I will get a pot of stew started you both can eat from as you're hungry. Izzy can come by each day and help if you need it." Isabel smiled and ran her finger over the soft tufts of hair on the baby girl's head. "I can. They are beautiful, Lula. Do you have names picked for them?" Lula laid the little girl on the bed, then the boy next to her. "We'd picked out a name for both a boy and a girl, but we'd never thought we might need them both. I'd like to check with Barton before we tell anyone." The babies wiggled slightly in their sleep, but stilled quickly, curling against one another. Isabel brushed a lock of damp, curly blonde hair from Lula's face. "I need to go find Conrad. I'll send Barton back here when I find him. I would suspect they're together." Lula nodded but didn't look up. Her attention was completely taken with her new family, and another ache built in Isabel's chest. She would have to wait for her own precious blessings. Before she could even allow herself to consider children, she had to convince a certain cowboy that she was ready for his suit. As Conrad rode toward the barn, Barton close behind, he caught sight of Isabel, her blue dress waving softly in the breeze as she waited for them. Barton saw her just a moment later and kicked Star to a run. If Isabel were worried, she wouldn't be standing so calmly, waiting for them. But part of him wanted to spur Talon to a run too, just to get to her quicker. Barton dismounted, and as Conrad rode up and reined in, Barton dropped to his knees. Conrad was off his horse in a flash, and he ran just as Barton returned to his feet. "Twins," Barton breathed. "Two?" Conrad glanced to Isabel, and her radiant smile about had him falling just like Barton. "Twins," she confirmed. "Now, you need to get home and help her name them." Barton reached for his mount and was gone in seconds. Though they were standing in the middle of the open, he felt alone with her. Isabel searched his face for a moment, then stepped toward him. He loved how she was always closing the gap between them. That was all at once terrifying and beautiful. She paused as pain crossed over her pretty blue eyes. "I did it, Conrad. I didn't think I could watch her, not after what he did to me, but I did. Now my heart aches all the more for what I lost." A sick dread struck him, and he opened his arms to her. She sighed and crushed herself to him. The tiny woman was stronger than she looked, and he cradled her there, never wanting to let her go, but knowing he must until she was ready. "Isabel, I told you I'd never send you away, and I mean it. You can take all the time you need to heal." Her body shuddered, but it was her words that cut him deep into his heart. "He killed my baby, Conrad. I would have gladly taken his words on my shoulders every day for the rest of my life, if he'd just left our baby alone." He tightened his grip around her, but words failed him. There was nothing he could do. Harland was already dead, and words wouldn't amount to much of anything. "You've lived through more than some women will ever face, and you've come out stronger for it. I don't know what the purpose was, or if you were ever meant to be with him at all, but I do know you were meant to be here, now, with me. I feel it right down to my bones." She glanced up at him, and he wanted to kiss her, to chase all the hurt from her eyes. "I know. I feel the same, and that's why I wrote a letter to my mother this morning. Would you take me into Belfouche to mail it? I'd also like to see this building Moretta told me about. It might make a good bakery. I've decided I'm staying in Belfouche." Town was too far away to go every day, and he wanted her nearby whenever he had a mind to see her, for the rest of his life. "Only if you want to. You'll be busy for the next while helping Lula, and if you're really looking for someone to bake for, I know a guy who's always hungry." She laughed, and the change that came over her face was a beauty to behold. "I don't have to start a bakery, but I do want something. Do you think banking for this hungry man would take up my time? Would I feel accomplished at the end of the day?" He tilted his head and smiled. "He might not eat enough to keep you cooking all day, but his house might need a little sprucing up, and his sister-in-law definitely needs help for a while." She swatted his shoulder. "Are you hiring me as a housekeeper for Arnold?" Her lips tilted up slightly in an impertinent grin. Oh, how he loved her spunk. He shook his head and adored the surprised sweet O of her lips as he dipped his head to taste them. It was only a moment, just a sample, but he couldn't wait a moment longer. "No, I'm asking you to stay here on this ranch with me. Stay here until you're ready to walk down the aisle to me. I can be the man he never was. I want to give you the sun and moon and everything in between." Isabel stared at him for a moment, the stunned O of her lips still in place as a tear rolled down her cheek. "And you said you weren't one for pretty words. I think that's the most beautiful poetry I've ever heard."